In 2013, investigators uncovered a horrifying scene in the Mojave Desert. Hidden beneath shallow graves were the remains of Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their 2 young children. The family had disappeared nearly 4 years earlier. What began as a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation, and suspicion would soon fall on someone once trusted by the family. In Fallbrook, California, the McStay family appeared to be living a comfortable and stable life. 40-year-old Joseph McStay lived there with his wife, Summer Martelli, who was 43 years old, and their 2 young sons, 4-year-old Gianni and 3-year-old Joseph Mateo. The family lived in a spacious home and seemed financially secure. Summer worked in real estate, while Joseph operated a custom fountain and decorative business. To friends and neighbors, the McStays appeared close-knit and family-oriented. Joseph was known as a hard-working provider, while Summer devoted much of her time to caring for their children. Their 2 boys were often described as cheerful and energetic. Nothing at the time suggested the family would soon become the center of a mysterious missing persons case. On the 4th of February 2010, the day began like any other for the McStay family. At around 10 a.m., Joseph left for his office to meet with his business associate, Charles Chase Merritt. The meeting appeared routine, and Joseph later returned home. There were no reported arguments, disturbances, or obvious signs of trouble before the family disappeared. Within days, people close to the family began noticing something was wrong. Joseph stopped answering calls and failed to show up for work. At first, some employees assumed the family had gone away for a short vacation. Joseph's father, Patrick McStay, was not convinced. Several days had passed without contact, which was highly unusual for Joseph, who normally stayed in touch with his parents. Patrick continued trying to reach him, but Joseph's phone remained off and none of the messages were returned. Around the same time, Joseph's business associate, Charles Merritt, also became concerned by the sudden silence. He contacted Joseph's brother, Michael McStay, to ask if he had heard from the family. Initially, Michael did not see the situation as an emergency. He believed Joseph may have left town without informing relatives. But that explanation quickly became harder to believe. On February 13, Joseph's mother, Susan, asked Michael to drive to the family home and check on them personally. When Michael arrived, the house was locked and unusually quiet. After getting no response, he entered through an open back window. Inside, the home was empty. Joseph's vehicle was gone from the garage, suggesting the family may have left on their own. But several details inside the house immediately felt out of place. Food had been left on the dining table and had already begun to spoil. Dirty laundry remained untouched in a basket, as if normal routines had suddenly stopped. Then Michael noticed something else. The family's 2 dogs had been left alone in the backyard for days. According to Michael, Joseph and Summer would never have left their pets behind without arranging for someone to care for them. The condition of the home suggested the family had left abruptly, with no clear explanation. On the 15th of February 2010, Michael McStay and Joseph's parents officially reported the family missing. The initial response from authorities was discouraging. Investigators believed the McStays had likely left voluntarily. By then, the family had already been out of contact for 10 days. Only after Michael continued pressing investigators did police begin treating the case more seriously and launch a formal investigation. When officers searched the home, they found no signs of forced entry, robbery, or struggle. Investigators also discovered a suitcase partially packed with clothing, reinforcing the theory that the family may have left willingly. As detectives worked through the timeline, they reviewed surveillance footage captured by a neighbor's security camera. The video showed Joseph's white 1996 Isuzu Trooper leaving the neighborhood at around 8 p.m. It would become the last confirmed sighting of the vehicle near the family's home. Police began tracing the SUV's movements and asked the public to report possible sightings. At first, investigators believed the family might eventually return on their own. But that assumption changed after authorities learned the Isuzu Trooper had been towed and impounded near the Mexican border. The discovery raised new questions and pushed the investigation in a far more troubling direction. As investigators searched for answers, they began considering another possibility. Detectives theorized that Joseph may have voluntarily traveled to Mexico with his family without informing relatives or friends. They also suspected the family's phones had been intentionally turned off. The theory gained traction after investigators reviewed records from Joseph's computer. Among the searches were queries related to travel documents required for children entering Mexico. To detectives, the activity suggested possible advanced planning. But Joseph's family strongly rejected that explanation. Patrick and Susan McStay insisted Joseph would never abandon his business, finances, and responsibilities without warning. Several details also raised doubts about the theory. Private investigators noted that Joseph reportedly had around $100,000 in his accounts, yet none of the money had been accessed after the family vanished. Investigators also questioned how the family could have crossed into Mexico because the McStays' passports had reportedly expired before the disappearance. As more evidence was examined, the theory became increasingly difficult to support. As weeks turned into months, the disappearance became increasingly difficult to explain. A businessman, his wife, and their 2 young children had vanished without a clear explanation. There were no confirmed sightings, no direct communication, and no evidence showing where the family had gone. Detectives continued interviewing people connected to Joseph, including employees from his company. According to those who worked closely with him, Joseph's business appeared stable in the days leading up to the disappearance. Employees said he did not seem unusually stressed or distracted. Investigators also found no indication that Joseph had been preparing to abandon his company or suddenly leave his life behind. As detectives examined the family's finances, relationships, and daily routines, the case only became more puzzling. There were no obvious signs of financial trouble, no confirmed personal disputes severe enough to explain the disappearance, and no evidence suggesting the family had carefully planned to vanish. With each failed lead, the investigation grew more unsettling. The absence of answers was becoming as significant as the evidence investigators had already uncovered. In April 2010, roughly 2 months after the McStay family disappeared, investigators announced a new development connected to surveillance footage near the Mexican border. The video showed a family of 4 walking toward a border crossing gate. The footage was blurry and captured from behind, making it impossible to clearly identify the individuals. Still, investigators noted that the number of people, along with their general height and build, appeared consistent with Joseph, Summer, and their 2 children. The recording was dated the 8th of February, 2010, 4 days after the family was last confirmed to be at home. To investigators, the footage appeared to support the theory that the McStays had voluntarily traveled to Mexico. As a result, authorities no longer believed the family was facing immediate danger, and the investigation gradually slowed. But the footage also raised new questions. There was no confirmed evidence showing the family after the alleged border crossing. No additional surveillance recordings surfaced, and no verified sightings placed the McStays anywhere inside Mexico. For Joseph's relatives, the conclusions being drawn from the video felt premature. The footage could not confirm the identities of the people shown, and investigators still had no clear evidence explaining what happened afterward. Still convinced something had gone wrong, Patrick and Susan McStay hired private investigator Tim Miller, who was known for handling missing persons cases. After reviewing the case, Miller and his team visited the McStay home to conduct their own assessment. Inside the residence, Miller became concerned about how the scene had been handled during the early stages of the investigation. According to Miller, the home should have been secured immediately after the family was reported missing. Instead, several people had reportedly entered the property before investigators completed a full examination. To Miller, that raised the possibility that important evidence may have been disturbed or lost. He later criticized aspects of the early investigation publicly, arguing that stricter procedures should have been followed in a case involving the unexplained disappearance of an entire family. Local authorities defended their handling of the case and stated that investigators, along with the FBI, had spent significant time pursuing the theory that the McStays had traveled voluntarily to Mexico. But despite those efforts, the investigation still lacked clear answers. Months had already passed, and the investigation stalled as theories continued to conflict. As time passed, the investigation gradually lost momentum. Weeks turned into months, and eventually years, with no confirmed explanation for what had happened to the McStay family. There were no verified sightings, no direct communication, and no reliable trail for investigators to follow. With so little evidence available, speculation surrounding the case continued to grow. Some believed the family had voluntarily disappeared to start a new life elsewhere. Others suspected something far more serious had happened. But despite the growing theories, investigators still lacked evidence supporting any single explanation. Nearly 3 years after the family vanished, the mystery remained unresolved, and the fate of Joseph, Summer, and their 2 sons was still unknown. Then, on the 11th of November, 2013, the case took a devastating turn. A motorcyclist traveling through a remote section of the Mojave Desert near Victorville, California, noticed what appeared to be human remains partially exposed in the dirt. After stopping to look more closely, he discovered additional remains buried nearby beneath the shallow desert soil. He quickly contacted authorities.
911, what's your emergency?
I'm out here on a motorcycle out behind the dump, and I found what looks like a human skull.
Investigators arrived and secured the area while forensic teams began excavating the site. As the search continued, investigators uncovered 2 shallow graves. Each contained the remains of 1 adult and 1 child. The remains were transported for forensic examination, while detectives searched the surrounding area for additional evidence. Nearby, investigators recovered a sledgehammer, which was soon considered potentially significant to the case. 4 days after the discovery, on the 15th of November, 2013, Sheriff John McMahon held a national press conference. During the announcement, authorities confirmed that the remains recovered from the Mojave Desert belonged to Joseph McStay, Summer McStay, and their 2 young sons. Investigators relied heavily on dental records to make the identifications due to the condition of the remains after years in the desert. After more than 3 years of uncertainty, the McStay family had finally been found. But the confirmation also changed the case permanently. What had once been treated as a missing persons investigation was now officially a homicide case. Autopsy findings later confirmed that all 4 victims had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. For Joseph's relatives, the discovery ended years of uncertainty while opening an even more painful reality. The family now faced a different question entirely. Who had killed Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Mateo? And why had their bodies been buried in the desert? Investigators now intensified efforts to identify the person responsible. Soon after the victims were identified, investigators returned to Joseph's Isuzu Trooper for a more extensive forensic examination. During the reanalysis of the vehicle, detectives uncovered evidence that had previously gone unnoticed. Small traces of blood were discovered on the steering wheel and gear shift. The finding drew immediate attention because it suggested someone other than Joseph may have recently driven the SUV. Laboratory testing later linked the DNA from the blood traces to Charles Chase Merritt, Joseph's business associate and longtime associate of the family. For years, Merritt had appeared cooperative during the investigation and remained in contact with Joseph's relatives as the search for answers continued. Now, however, his name had surfaced through one of the most significant pieces of forensic evidence recovered in the case. Charles Merritt was not an outsider to the McStay family. He had worked closely with Joseph and was considered both a business associate and trusted friend. In the early stages of the investigation, Merritt attracted little suspicion. He appeared cooperative and publicly expressed concern about the family's disappearance. But as detectives reviewed the timeline more carefully, they began noticing how closely Merritt had been connected to the case from the beginning. He was among the first people to contact Joseph's relatives after the family vanished, placing him near the center of events almost immediately. As investigators looked deeper into Merritt's background, additional concerns emerged. Detectives learned that he had reportedly been dealing with serious financial problems. His business was struggling. He carried significant debt, and investigators uncovered a history of gambling-related issues. Records later showed that Merritt owed Joseph more than $42,000. The discovery led investigators to consider whether financial pressure may have provided a motive. Investigators then uncovered another troubling allegation. After the McStay family disappeared, Merritt was accused of forging several of Joseph's checks in an attempt to access company funds. Detectives also learned that Merritt had prior convictions involving robbery and burglary-related offenses. As the investigation progressed, more evidence appeared to place him under increasing scrutiny. Cell phone records reportedly showed Merritt near the desert area, where the family's remains were later discovered. Investigators eventually developed the theory that Merritt had killed the family, dumped the bodies in shallow graves in the Mojave Desert, and buried them in shallow graves. Detectives also suspected he may have driven the McStay family's vehicle toward the Mexican border in an effort to create the appearance of a voluntary disappearance. Authorities further believe the Mexico-related searches found on Joseph's computer may have been part of that effort to mislead investigators. Suspicion was now focusing heavily on someone once trusted by the family. On the 7th of November 2014, authorities announced the arrest of Charles Chase Merritt. He was formally charged in connection with the deaths of Joseph, Summer, and their 2 children. The arrest marked a major turning point in the investigation. For years, Merritt had been viewed as a close friend and longtime business associate of Joseph McStay. To many people connected to the case, including Joseph's father, Patrick, the accusations were difficult to process. Patrick later revealed that Joseph had expressed concerns about Merritt's professionalism in business dealings roughly a year before the family disappeared. Despite those concerns, Joseph reportedly continued working with him and had even tried to support him financially. After his arrest, Merritt denied any involvement in the deaths of the McStay family. Investigators never obtained a confession or a definitive explanation for what happened before the family vanished. As a result, many unanswered questions would eventually be debated in court. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors developed a theory about what they believed had happened to the McStay family. Investigators believe the family was killed inside the McStay home before the bodies were transported to the Mojave Desert. Prosecutors also argued that Joseph's relationship with Charles Merritt had become increasingly strained in the period leading up to the disappearance, largely because of business and financial disputes. Prosecutors believed financial pressure and conflict may have motivated Merritt to kill the family. But the defense strongly challenged that theory. Defense attorneys argued that much of the case relied on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. They pointed out that Merritt's DNA found inside the family vehicle was classified as only a minor contribution. The defense also emphasized that investigators found no direct forensic evidence inside the McStay home tying Merritt to the killings. Those gaps became a central focus throughout the legal battle. Even so, prosecutors argued that the combined weight of the evidence pointed to a larger pattern. They continued citing Merritt's financial troubles, the allegations involving forged checks, phone records, and the DNA evidence recovered from the McStay vehicle. Ultimately, the case would depend on how the jury interpreted the evidence. After years of investigation and public speculation, the trial of Charles Chase Merritt began on the 7th of January, 2019, in San Bernardino, California. By that point, nearly a decade had passed since the McStay family disappeared. The trial drew widespread attention as prosecutors and defense attorneys presented sharply different interpretations of the evidence. Over several months, jurors heard testimony from investigators, forensic experts, financial analysts, and people connected to both Merritt and the McStay family. Prosecutors argued that the overall pattern of evidence pointed clearly toward Merritt's involvement. Meanwhile, the defense emphasized the absence of direct forensic evidence linking him to the killings inside the home. As the proceedings continued, the case became a detailed examination of timelines, financial records, forensic evidence, and competing theories about what happened to the family. Then, on the 10th of June 2019, after months of testimony, the jury finally reached a verdict. Charles Chase Merritt was convicted on multiple charges connected to the deaths of Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Mateo McStay. The verdict marked the conclusion of a case that had remained unresolved for nearly a decade. For Joseph's relatives, the ruling brought a measure of legal closure after years of investigation and courtroom proceedings. But even after the conviction, Merritt continued denying responsibility for the deaths. On the 21st of January 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison for the death of Joseph McStay. He also received death sentences for the killings of Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. Merritt remains incarcerated while additional legal proceedings and appeals continue. Even after the conviction, important questions about the case remain unresolved. Investigators were able to build a timeline and present evidence in court, but many details about the family's final hours were never fully established. Authorities still do not know exactly what happened inside the McStay home before the family disappeared, or the precise sequence of events that led to their deaths. Charles Merritt has never provided a full confession or explanation describing what occurred. Because of that, some parts of the case remain incomplete. What began as the unexplained disappearance of a family eventually became one of California's most widely followed true crime cases. Yet even after years of investigation, some questions may never be answered.